As I stood on the steps of First Baptist Church, my hands trembled despite the June heat. Inside those hallowed walls, my only son David was getting married to a woman who had made it clear that I was not welcome in their new life. I straightened my navy dress jacket, the same one I'd worn to his college graduation, and took a deep breath before pulling open the heavy wooden doors. The sanctuary was already filled with the soft murmur of guests and the gentle notes of a string quartet. Flowers cascaded from every surface, white roses and lilies that Sarah, my soon-to-be daughter-in-law, had insisted upon. I made my way down the aisle, nodding at familiar faces. Some smiled warmly, others quickly averted their eyes. News travels fast in small towns like ours, and everyone knew about the tension between Sarah and me. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. I found my seat in the front row, the place reserved for immediate family. The empty chair beside me felt like a wound. My wife, Margaret, would have known how to handle this situation with grace. She had always been the peacemaker, the heart of our family. But cancer had taken her 3 years ago, leaving David and me to figure out how to be a family without her. The music shifted, and the wedding party began their procession. My chest tightened as David appeared at the altar, tall and handsome in his tuxedo. His face was a perfect blend of Margaret's gentle eyes and my stubborn jaw. Pride swelled within me, remembering the boy who had once needed me to tie his shoes and explain how engines worked. Now he stood as a man, a successful architect with a life of his own. When Sarah appeared at the back of the church, the congregation rose. She was beautiful, I couldn't deny that. Her blonde hair swept up elegantly, her dress a cascade of lace and satin. Her father, a prominent surgeon I'd met only twice, walked her down the aisle with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his place in the world. As they reached the altar, Dr. Richards placed Sarah's hand in David's, but then she did something unexpected. She turned to me, her smile perfectly in place but her eyes cold as winter frost. "He doesn't need you anymore," she whispered, just loud enough for me to hear. "I'm his family now." The words hit me like a physical blow. I kept my face neutral, years of working construction having taught me how to mask pain. Around us, guests were smiling, oblivious to the dagger that had just been slipped between my ribs. David hadn't heard. He was looking at the minister, his face alight with happiness. I sat through the ceremony in a fog, mechanically standing when others stood, sitting when they sat. The vows were exchanged, rings placed on fingers, and a kiss that sealed my son to a woman who saw me as competition rather than family. When the minister presented them as Mr. and Mrs. David Coleman, the church erupted in applause, but my hands felt like lead weights. At the reception, I found myself relegated to a table far from the head table, tucked between distant relatives and colleagues of the Richards family. My place card had been handwritten, unlike the elegant calligraphy of the other guests, a small slight that spoke volumes about my position in this new hierarchy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. I watched from a distance as David and Sarah moved among their guests, accepting congratulations and posing for photographs. My son's eyes occasionally searched the crowd, finding me in my corner. He would smile, wave, and I would raise my glass in response. The distance between us felt like miles rather than yards. "Not exactly the place of honor for the father of the groom," a voice remarked beside me. I turned to find Nancy, Margaret's sister, sliding into the empty chair next to mine. Her familiar face, so like my late wife's, was a balm to my wounded spirit. "Sarah has her own ideas about family hierarchy," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. "David seems happy, and that's what matters." Nancy's eyes, sharp as ever, missed nothing. "Margaret would have put a stop to this nonsense. That girl has been pushing you out since day one." I couldn't argue with her assessment. From the moment David had introduced Sarah 2 years ago, she had made it clear that she found me lacking. My weathered hands and simple education didn't fit into her vision of the perfect family. When David proposed 6 months later, Sarah's plans for the wedding had systematically minimized my role. "First, she moved your toast to after her father's," Nancy continued, ticking off points on her fingers. Then she forgot to include you in the rehearsal dinner. Now you're seated with people who don't even know David's middle name. Nancy, I warned, this is their day. I won't make a scene. You're too much like her father, she said softly, patting my hand. Margaret always said that was why she fell in love with you. Steady as bedrock, even when the earth shakes. The comparison to my late wife's father, a man I had deeply respected, made my throat tighten. Harold Mitchell had welcomed me into his family despite my lack of college education, seeing beyond my rough exterior to the man who loved his daughter with everything I had. As the evening progressed, I nursed a single glass of champagne, watching as the celebration swirled around me. The cake was cut, the first dance shared, and still I remained in my corner, a spectator at my own son's wedding. When it came time for the father-daughter dance, Dr. Richards led Sarah onto the floor with practiced ease, their movements as perfect as a performance. Then the DJ announced the mother-son dance, and the room went quiet. We had discussed this moment, David and I, in one of our rare private conversations leading up to the wedding. Margaret's absence was a hole that couldn't be filled, and David had suggested skipping the tradition altogether. And now, the DJ's voice cut through my thoughts, Sarah would like to invite her mother, Elizabeth, to share this special dance with David as they celebrate the blending of their families. The knife twisted deeper. I watched as my son took his mother-in-law's hand, leading her onto the dance floor while the opening notes of "What a Wonderful World," Margaret's favorite song, filled the room. The song we had danced to at our own wedding. The song I had hummed to David when he was a colicky infant and nothing else would soothe him. Nancy's hand found mine under the table, squeezing tightly. "Jack," she whispered, "you don't have to stay." But I did. I stayed because leaving would have hurt David, and I had promised myself long ago that I would never be the cause of my son's pain. So I watched as he danced with Elizabeth Richards, as Sarah looked on with satisfaction, as guests wiped away tears at the touching moment. When the dance ended, David kissed his mother-in-law's cheek and then, to my surprise, scanned the room until he found me. He whispered something to Elizabeth, who nodded, and then made his way through the crowd toward my table. "Dad," he said, slightly out of breath, "I've been trying to get over here all night, but you know how these things go." He gestured vaguely at the reception in full swing. "You've been busy," I replied, standing to embrace him. "It's a beautiful wedding, son." "Listen," he lowered his voice, "about the dance. Sarah thought it would be nice to include her mom, and I didn't know how to." "It's fine, David." I cut him off, not wanting to see the conflict in his eyes. "Your mother would have loved to see you dancing with Elizabeth. It was a nice gesture." The relief on his face was worth the lie. "Thanks, Dad. I was worried you might be upset." "I'm just happy to see you happy," I told him, and that much was true. Margaret would be so proud of the man you've become. At the mention of his mother, David's eyes grew suspiciously bright. "I wish she was here." "Me too, son. Every day." I cleared my throat. "Now get back to your bride before she sends a search party." He laughed, the tension broken. "She's just nervous about everything being perfect. You know how she gets." I did know. I had watched for 2 years as Sarah micromanaged every aspect of their relationship, isolating David from his old friends, rearranging his priorities, and gradually pushing me to the periphery of his life. "She'll settle down after today," I said, offering him the reassurance he seemed to need. Marriage has a way of revealing what's truly important. David squeezed my shoulder. "I'll bring her over in a bit. She wants to thank you for the gift." The gift had been a struggle. What do you give a couple who seems to have everything? In the end, I had settled on something personal. A handcrafted chest made from oak, salvaged from the maple tree that had stood in our backyard throughout David's childhood. The tree had been felled during a storm last year, and I had carefully dried and prepared the wood, then spent months crafting the chest in my workshop. Inside, I had placed a letter from Margaret that she had written to David on his first birthday, to be opened on his wedding day. I watched David weave his way back to Sarah, who was deep in conversation with her bridesmaids. She glanced in my direction, her smile faltering just enough that only someone watching closely would notice. She said something to David, who nodded and then turned toward the bar instead of bringing her to meet me as promised. "That girl has his compass all turned around," Nancy muttered beside me. "Margaret would be heartbroken to see it." "He loves her," I said simply. "We have to respect that." "Respect doesn't mean sitting quietly while she erases you from his life," Nancy retorted, her voice sharp with the directness that had always characterized my sister-in-law. "Margaret wouldn't have stood for it, and you shouldn't either." The weight of her words settled heavily on my shoulders. Margaret had been my North Star for 35 years, guiding me through the rough waters of life with her unwavering faith in what was right. Without her, I had been adrift, uncertain how to navigate this new terrain where my son's happiness seemed to require my absence. As the evening wore on, I found myself increasingly isolated. David was pulled in a dozen different directions, and each time he seemed about to make his way to my table, Sarah would appear at his elbow with another guest he simply had to meet, or another photograph that needed to be taken. It was nearing midnight when I finally decided it was time to leave. The reception had thinned out, with only the youngest guest still on the dance floor. I had said my goodbyes to Nancy hours earlier, promising to call her the next day. I stood, straightening my jacket, and made my way toward the exit, hoping to slip out unnoticed. Leaving without saying goodbye? David's voice stopped me at the door. He stood alone, his tie loosened, hair slightly disheveled from hours of celebration. "I didn't want to interrupt," I said, turning to face him. "You've had your hands full." "Dad," he sighed, running a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of Margaret that it made my heart ache. "I know today hasn't been... well, it hasn't gone the way we might have wanted." "It's been perfect," I assured him. "Exactly what you and Sarah dreamed of." "Not exactly," he admitted, his voice low. "Mom should have been here." "She is here," I said, placing a hand over my heart. "She's always with us, David." He nodded, blinking rapidly. "I read her letter, the one in the chest. I thought you might want some privacy for that." "She knew," he said, his voice cracking slightly. "Somehow, she knew exactly what I would need to hear today." Margaret had always possessed an uncanny ability to see into the hearts of those she loved. I wasn't surprised that her words, written 28 years ago, had found their mark. "Your mother was wise that way," I said. "She could see around corners the rest of us didn't even know existed." David stepped forward suddenly, enveloping me in a hug that caught me by surprise. For a moment, he wasn't a grown man in a tuxedo but my little boy again, holding on for dear life as the world shifted beneath his feet. "I love you, Dad," he whispered fiercely. "Don't ever forget that." "I love you too, son," I replied, my voice rough with emotion. "Always have, always will." When we pulled apart, I was surprised to see tears on his cheeks. "David, what's wrong?" He shook his head, wiping at his face. "Nothing. Everything." "I don't know." He took a deep breath. "Sarah and I are leaving for Paris tomorrow. 2 weeks away." "Your honeymoon should be special," I said, trying to inject enthusiasm into my voice. "Your mother always wanted to see Paris." "When we get back," he continued, as if I hadn't spoken, "things are going to be different. I promise." Before I could ask what he meant, Sarah appeared in the doorway behind him, her perfect composure slightly frayed around the edges after the long day. "David?" "Everyone's waiting for our exit," she said, her eyes darting between us suspiciously. "Just saying goodnight to my dad," David replied, straightening his shoulders. Sarah's smile was tight as she extended her hand to me. "Thank you for coming, Jack. And for the lovely gift." Her voice was honey over ice, sweet on the surface but cold underneath. I took her hand briefly, noting the firmness of her grip, a woman used to controlling her environment. "Be happy," I said, looking directly into her eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted for my son." Something flickered in her gaze. Surprise, perhaps, or a moment of genuine emotion breaking through her carefully constructed facade. Then it was gone, replaced by the polished smile she wore like armor. "We should go," she said to David, looping her arm through his. "Everyone's waiting." David hesitated, looking back at me. "Dad?" "Go on," I said, gesturing toward the door. "Your bride is right. Don't keep your guests waiting." He nodded, allowing Sarah to lead him away. At the door, he paused, looking back over his shoulder. "I'll call you when we get back." I raised my hand in acknowledgement, knowing such promises were easily forgotten in the excitement of newlywed life. As they disappeared back into the reception hall, I stepped out into the warm June night, the stars overhead a brilliant canopy against the darkness. The parking lot was nearly empty now, just a few cars remaining. I made my way to my truck, the same Ford F-150 I'd driven for the past 15 years. The familiarity of the worn leather seat and the rumble of the engine as it started were comforting in their constancy. As I pulled out of the church parking lot, I glanced in my rearview mirror. The building was lit up like a beacon, the celebration inside continuing without me. Just like David's life would continue, with or without my presence. I drove through the quiet streets of our town, past the high school where David had played football, past the park where I had taught him to ride a bike, past the ice cream shop where we had gone every Sunday after church when Margaret was still with us. Each landmark a memory, each memory a reminder of what had been lost and what had changed. When I reached the small house that had been our family home for 30 years, I sat in the driveway for a long moment, gathering the strength to go inside alone. The porch light was on. I always left it burning when I knew I'd be coming home after dark, a habit Margaret had instilled in me. Inside, the silence was profound. I moved through the familiar rooms, turning on lights as I went, pushing back against the darkness that seemed to press in from all sides. In the kitchen, I put on the kettle for tea, another of Margaret's habits that I had adopted in her absence. As the water heated, I removed my tie and jacket, draping them over a kitchen chair. My fingers brushed against something in the jacket pocket. A small, folded piece of paper I didn't remember placing there. I pulled it out, unfolding it carefully. It was a note, written in David's hasty scrawl. "Dad, I know today was hard. I'm sorry for the ways I've let you down. When I get back, we need to talk. There's a lot I need to say. Love, D." I read the words again, then a third time, trying to decipher the meaning behind them. The kettle whistled, pulling me from my thoughts. I made my tea mechanically, my mind still turning over David's note. As I sat at the kitchen table, the house quiet around me, I thought about the day's events. Sarah's whispered dismissal, the dance that should have been mine, the distance that had grown between my son and me. But I also thought about David's fierce hug, his tears, and now this note, slipped into my pocket when I wasn't looking. Perhaps Nancy was right. Perhaps it was time to stop being so steady, so accommodating. Perhaps it was time to fight for my place in my son's life. I sipped my tea, watching the moon rise through the kitchen window. Margaret would have known what to do. She always did. But Margaret wasn't here, and for the first time in 3 years, I allowed myself to feel the full weight of navigating this world without her guidance. Tomorrow, David and Sarah would fly to Paris. 2 weeks, he had said. 2 weeks for me to decide what kind of father I wanted to be in this new chapter of our lives. 2 weeks to find the courage to speak the truth, even if it meant risking the fragile peace we had maintained. I finished my tea and rinsed the cup, placing it in the dish drainer. In the living room, I paused at the mantel, where photographs chronicled our family's history. Margaret and me on our wedding day, David's first steps, his graduation, the 3 of us standing on the rim of the Grand Canyon, squinting into the sun. "I miss you," I whispered to Margaret's smiling image. "I don't know how to do this without you." As if in answer, the night breeze stirred the curtains, carrying with it the scent of the roses Margaret had planted years ago. They still bloomed every summer, faithful to her memory, resilient despite her absence. I touched the frame of our wedding photo, remembering the vows we had exchanged. For better or worse, in sickness and in health. We had weathered it all together, building a life brick by brick with our own hands. A good life. A life worth fighting for. I took David's note from my pocket, reading it one more time in the dim light. When I get back, we need to talk. There's a lot I need to say. Whatever was coming, I would face it. For David. For Margaret. For the family we had been, and the family we might still be. As I climbed the stairs to my empty bedroom, I felt, for the first time since Margaret's death, the stirring of hope. Not the desperate hope of denial, but the quiet hope of possibility. The possibility that tomorrow might be better than today. The possibility that what was broken could be mended. The possibility that love, in all its messy, complicated glory, might yet find a way. The 2 weeks of David and Sarah's honeymoon stretched before me like a vast desert. I found myself checking my phone constantly, though I knew international calls were expensive and newlyweds had better things to do than check in with aging parents. Still, I couldn't help the small flicker of hope each time the screen lit up. I threw myself into work, spending long hours in my workshop behind the house. The familiar rhythm of sawing, sanding, and staining was therapeutic. The physical labor a welcome distraction from the thoughts that plagued me. I was working on a set of dining chairs commissioned by a local family. My small woodworking business had grown steadily over the years, word of mouth bringing me enough clients to keep busy since my retirement from construction. On the 4th day after the wedding, I was surprised by a knock at my workshop door. Nancy stood there, a covered dish in her hands and determination in her eyes. "You're not answering your phone," she said, pushing past me into the shop. "And I'm betting you haven't eaten a proper meal since the wedding." I couldn't argue with her assessment. My refrigerator contained little more than condiments and a carton of milk past its prime. "I've been busy," I gestured to the half-finished chair taking shape on my workbench. "Too busy to eat?" She set the dish down and fixed me with the same look Margaret used to give me when I was being particularly stubborn. "Jack Coleman, you're 62 years old. You can't live on coffee and spite." Despite myself, I smiled. "Is that lasagna?" "Margaret's recipe," she confirmed. "Now wash up and come inside. We need to talk." I followed her into the house, suddenly aware of the thin layer of dust that had settled on every surface. Housekeeping had never been my strong suit. But with Margaret gone and David rarely visiting, I'd let things slide more than usual. Nancy didn't comment on the state of the house. She simply moved into the kitchen with the familiarity of someone who had spent countless holidays and Sunday dinners within these walls. She served the lasagna, poured 2 glasses of iced tea, and sat across from me at the kitchen table. "Have you heard from him?" she asked, cutting straight to the chase. I shook my head. "It's their honeymoon, Nancy. I don't expect a call." "That note he slipped you means something," she insisted. "David knows what's happening. He's not blind." I took a bite of lasagna, letting the familiar flavors wash over me. It tasted like Sunday afternoons and family dinners, like a time when things were simpler. "Even if he does," I said finally, "what can he do? She's his wife now. He can stand up for you." Nancy's fork clinked against her plate. "He can draw boundaries. He can be a man instead of a puppet." "Nancy," I warned, "he's my son. Watch it." She softened slightly. "I'm sorry. You know I love David like he was my own. That's why it kills me to see him let that woman push you out of his life." Margaret would be heartbroken. I pushed my plate away, my appetite suddenly gone. "Margaret isn't here, and I'm doing the best I can without her." Nancy reached across the table and took my hand. Her fingers were cool against my skin, her wedding ring catching the afternoon light. "You're not alone in this, Jack. Margaret was my sister, which makes you family. Always." The simple declaration loosened something in my chest that had been tight since the wedding. "Thank you," I managed. "Now," she said, her practical nature reasserting itself, "we need a plan." "A plan for what?" I asked, wary of the determined glint in her eye. "For when they get back. You said David told you things would be different. We need to make sure they're different in the right way." I shook my head. "I'm not going to manipulate my son or interfere in his marriage." "It's not manipulation to stand up for yourself," Nancy countered. "And it's not interference to expect basic respect." She was right, of course. Margaret had always said her sister had a compass that pointed true north, even when everyone else was turned around. But the thought of confrontation, of potentially pushing David further away made my stomach churn. "Let me think about it," I said finally. Nancy nodded, accepting this small concession. "All right, but don't think too long. That girl has had 2 years to get her hooks in. You don't have the luxury of time." After she left, I wandered through the quiet house, seeing it through fresh eyes. Everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of our family history. The height marks on the kitchen doorframe tracking David's growth. The dent in the living room wall from when he had tried to practice baseball indoors. The faded armchair where Margaret had sat to read him bedtime stories. This wasn't just a house. It was the physical embodiment of our family story. And I was allowing Sarah to erase that story, one slight at a time. For the first time since Margaret's death, I felt a spark of something other than grief or resignation. It wasn't quite anger, more like resolve. A determination that while I might have failed to protect my place at the wedding, I wouldn't fail again. The next day, I called David's childhood friend Michael. They had been inseparable through high school and college, but I had noticed Michael's absence at the wedding. "Mr. Coleman," he answered, surprise evident in his voice. "It's good to hear from you." "Jack, please." I corrected him. "You're not 10 years old anymore." He laughed. "Old habits. What can I do for you?" "I was wondering if you'd heard from David recently," I said, trying to keep my tone casual. There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Not for a while," Michael admitted. "Things have been complicated since Sarah came into the picture." "You weren't at the wedding," I observed. Another pause. "I wasn't invited." The admission hung in the air between us. Michael had been like a second son to me, spending more nights under our roof than I could count. The thought that he had been deliberately excluded sent a chill through me. "Would you have time for a cup of coffee?" I asked impulsively. "I'd like to catch up." 2 hours later, we were sitting at a corner table in the local diner, 2 cups of coffee between us. Michael had grown into a fine young man, a high school English teacher with a quiet confidence that reminded me of his father. "I tried to warn him," Michael said, staring into his coffee. "About a year ago, when things started getting serious with Sarah. I could see what was happening, how she was isolating him, changing him." "What did he say?" I asked, though I could guess the answer. "He said I was jealous. That I didn't understand what love was." Michael's laugh was hollow. 20 years of friendship, and she managed to erase it in a matter of months. I nodded, recognizing the pattern. "She told him he doesn't need me anymore, right before the ceremony." Michael's head snapped up. "She said that to your face?" "She wanted me to know where I stood." "That's—" He struggled for words. "David would never have allowed that if he knew." "I'm not so sure anymore," I admitted. "He's changed." "No." Michael shook his head firmly. "I know David. The real David, not the version Sarah has created. He worships the ground you walk on. Always has." The conviction in his voice was a balm to my wounded spirit. "He left me a note," I told him. "At the wedding. Said we needed to talk when he gets back." Michael leaned forward. "See? That's the David the first know. Fighting to get through." We talked for another hour, comparing notes on the subtle ways Sarah had reshaped David's life, from his sudden interest in country club memberships to his decision to stop coaching Little League, something he had loved doing since college. As we parted, Michael hesitated. "Mr. C. Jack," he corrected himself. "When David gets back, I'd like to help, if I can." I clasped his shoulder. "You already have, son. More than you know." The conversation with Michael acted as a catalyst. Over the next week, I found myself reaching out to other people from David's life. His former coach, his college roommate, even his ex-girlfriend Melissa, who had remained a friend until Sarah put a stop to that relationship. Each conversation revealed another piece of the puzzle, another aspect of David's life that had been altered or erased to fit Sarah's vision. By the time the 2 weeks were nearing their end, I had a clearer picture of what we were facing, and I was more determined than ever not to lose my son. The day before David and Sarah were due to return, I did something I had been avoiding for 3 years. I went into Margaret's closet. Her clothes still hung there, untouched since her death. I hadn't been able to bring myself to donate them, though Nancy had gently suggested it might be time. The scent of her perfume had long since faded, but as I ran my fingers over the soft fabrics, I could almost feel her presence. At the back of the closet, on the highest shelf, was a small wooden box. Margaret's memory box, she had called it. I took it down carefully, carried it to our bed, and sat with it on my lap for a long moment before finding the courage to open it. Inside were the treasures of our life together: movie ticket stubs from our first date, the hospital bracelet from when David was born, pressed flowers from anniversaries, photographs that had never made it into albums. And at the bottom, a sealed envelope with my name written in Margaret's elegant script. My hands trembled as I opened it, unfolding the pages within. The letter was dated 3 weeks before she died. "My dearest Jack," it began, "if you're reading this, I'm gone, and you're facing something that feels impossible without me." I blinked back tears, hearing her voice in every word. "I know you, my love. Better than you know yourself sometimes. You're steady and strong, the rock our family has built its foundation on. But there are times when strength isn't about enduring, it's about standing up. About fighting for what matters." Her words cut through the fog of grief and uncertainty that had surrounded me since her diagnosis. "David will need you, even when he thinks he doesn't. Especially then. Don't let him push you away. Don't let anyone come between you. The bond between a father and son is sacred, Jack. It's worth fighting for." I read the letter 3 times, each word burning itself into my heart. In the 3 years since her death, I had been existing, not living. Drifting through my days like a ghost in my own life. But Margaret, even from beyond, was calling me back. "Be the man I fell in love with," she wrote in closing. "Brave enough to fight for what matters, wise enough to know what that is. I'm with you always. All my love, Margaret." I folded the letter carefully and returned it to the envelope. Then I did something I hadn't done since the day we buried her. I took off my wedding ring and threaded it onto the chain that held Margaret's ring against my heart. 2 circles, unbroken, resting together. "I hear you," I whispered. "I'll fight for him. I promise." The next morning I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I showered, shaved, and dressed with care, choosing the blue shirt Margaret had always said brought out my eyes. I made coffee, scrambled eggs, and sat at the kitchen table to wait. I didn't know when David would call or if he would come by, but I knew with absolute certainty that today would be different. Today I would fight for my son. The call came just after 10. David's voice sounded tired but determined. "Dad, we're back. Can I come over? Alone?" "Of course," I said, my heart racing. "I'll be here." An hour later, his car pulled into the driveway. I watched from the window as he sat for a moment, hands gripping the steering wheel, before finally getting out. He looked older somehow, as if the 2 weeks away had aged him. I met him at the door, and for an awkward moment, we stood staring at each other, neither sure how to begin. Then David stepped forward, enveloping me in a hug that felt like coming home. "I've missed you, Dad," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. "Missed you too, son," I replied, patting his back. "Come in. Coffee's hot." We moved to the kitchen, the familiar setting easing some of the tension. David took his usual seat at the table, the same place he had sat for breakfast every morning of his childhood. I poured 2 cups of coffee and joined him. "Paris was beautiful," he began, his eyes fixed on his cup. "Everything Sarah wanted it to be." I nodded, waiting. This wasn't why he had come, but I couldn't enjoy it, he continued, finally looking up at me. "Not fully. All I could think about was the wedding, the way she treated you, the things she said. My breath caught." "You heard?" "Not at the time," he admitted. "But on our last night in Paris, we had a fight. A big one. Things came out." I set my cup down carefully. "David, I never wanted to come between you and Sarah." "I know that, Dad." His smile was sad. "That's the difference between you and her. You've always put my happiness first, even when it hurt you." "You're my son," I said simply. "That's what parents do." He shook his head. Not all parents. Sarah's father sees her as an extension of himself, a reflection of his success. It's where she learned it, this idea that people are possessions, assets, or liabilities. The assessment was surprisingly insightful, revealing a level of awareness I hadn't realized David possessed. In Paris, he continued, I saw it clearly for the first time. How she's been trying to cut you out of my life. How she's been reshaping me into someone I don't recognize. What happened? I asked. David ran a hand through his hair. That gesture so like his mother's. I found her phone unlocked. She had texts with her mother about the wedding, about you. Horrible things, Dad. Planning ways to keep you at a distance. Laughing about how they'd managed to exclude you from the ceremony. The pain in his eyes was raw, a wound still fresh. I confronted her. She denied it at first, then tried to justify it. Said you were holding me back, that I needed to outgrow my simple upbringing if I wanted to succeed in her world. My throat tightened at the familiar refrain. And what did you say? I told her my father built this house with his own hands, that he put me through college working 60-hour weeks, that everything I am, everything I have, is because of the foundation you and Mom gave me. His voice broke. I told her I would never be ashamed of where I came from, or who my family is. Pride swelled in my chest, pushing back against the hurt of the past weeks. I'm glad you told her that. It didn't go over well, David admitted. She accused me of being childish, of choosing you over her. Said if I couldn't cut the apron strings, maybe we'd made a mistake. Son, I leaned forward. Marriage is sacred. If there's any way to work this out. That's just it, Dad, he interrupted. I'm not sure I want to work it out. Not if it means becoming someone I don't recognize. Not if it means losing you. The weight of his words hung between us. I had never wanted this, to be the reason my son's marriage failed before it had truly begun. And yet I couldn't deny the relief I felt at the possibility of having him back. The real David, not the polished, distant version Sarah had created. What do you want to do? I asked finally. He exhaled slowly. I don't know. I'm staying at Michael's for now. Sarah's furious. Says I'm being ridiculous. That I'll come crawling back when I realize what I'm throwing away. Will you? I couldn't help asking. David was quiet for a long moment. 3 days ago I would have said yes. The thought of failing at marriage, of admitting I made a mistake, it terrified me. He looked around the kitchen, his eyes taking in the familiar surroundings. But being here, in this house, remembering who I really am, it makes things clearer. I reached across the table and placed my hand on his. Whatever you decide, I'm here. Not to push or pull, just to support. I know, Dad. His smile was small but genuine. You always have been. We talked for hours, in a way we hadn't since before Margaret's illness. David shared stories from his honeymoon, the beautiful sights that had been overshadowed by the growing realization of his mistake. I told him about my conversations with Michael and the others, about the pattern we had all observed but had been too afraid to name. As afternoon faded into evening, David stood, stretching. I should go. Michael's expecting me for dinner. You're welcome to stay here, I offered. Your room's still the same. He shook his head. Not yet. I need some space to think. To figure out what happens next. I walked him to the door, a strange sense of déjà vu washing over me. How many times had I stood in this doorway, watching him leave for college, for dates, for his new life with Sarah? Dad, he said, turning back, I'm sorry. For all of it. For letting her push you away, for not seeing what was happening. You see it now, I replied. That's what matters. After his car disappeared down the street, I went back inside, the house somehow less empty than it had been that morning. I made myself a simple dinner, thinking about David's revelation and what it might mean for all of us. As I washed the dishes, my eyes fell on Margaret's letter, which I had left on the counter. I promised. I told her silently. And I'll keep promising. Every day. The phone rang, startling me from my thoughts. I dried my hands and answered it, expecting David, or maybe Nancy. Instead, Sarah's voice cut through the line, cold and precise. "I hope you're satisfied," she said without preamble. "You've managed to ruin everything." I took a deep breath, steadying myself. "Hello, Sarah. I was wondering when you'd call." "Don't play innocent with me," she snapped. "I know you've been poisoning him against me," filling his head with doubts. "I haven't spoken to David since the wedding," I replied truthfully. "Until today." "Liar," she hissed. "He was fine before we left. Happy. And now suddenly he's staying with that loser friend of his, talking about space and reevaluating." I gripped the phone tighter. Maybe he's just seeing things more clearly. "Let me make something very clear to you." Sarah's voice dropped, becoming dangerously soft. "David is my husband, my family. If you think I'm going to let you or anyone else come between us, you're sadly mistaken." "He's not a possession, Sarah," I said quietly. "He's a human being with his own mind, his own heart." "He's weak," she spat. "Sentimental, like you. But I can fix that." The naked contempt in her voice confirmed everything I had feared. "Why did you marry him?" I asked, genuinely curious. "If you think so little of who he is?" There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was controlled once more. "David has potential. The right connections, the right look. With proper guidance, he could go far. So, he's a project to you, not a partner. Call it what you want," she dismissed, "but know this, I will get him back. And when I do, you'll never see him again. That's a promise." The line went dead before I could respond. I stood in my kitchen, the phone still in my hand, Sarah's threat echoing in my ears. In all my years, through war, loss, and hardship, I had never hated anyone. But in that moment, I came dangerously close. I put the phone down and walked to the living room window, looking out at the darkening sky. The battle lines had been drawn. Sarah had made her intentions clear. The question now was whether David was strong enough to resist her pull, and whether I was brave enough to help him fight. The morning after Sarah's threatening phone call, I woke to the sound of rain drumming against the roof. It matched my mood, stormy, unsettled, but with the promise of cleansing what had grown stagnant. I made coffee and carried it to the front porch, watching the raindrops create ripples in the puddles forming on our cracked driveway. My phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can we meet for lunch?" "Need to talk." I typed back a quick affirmative, suggesting the diner where Margaret and I had taken him for Sunday breakfasts throughout his childhood. His response came almost immediately. "Perfect. Noon." As I dressed for the meeting, I noticed my hands were steady. The uncertainty that had plagued me since Margaret's death, the fear of making wrong decisions without her guidance, had been replaced by a calm resolve. Whatever happened with David and Sarah, I would no longer be a passive observer in my own life. The diner was busy with the lunch crowd when I arrived. Waitresses balanced plates along their arms. The kitchen doors swung open and closed with clockwork precision, and the air smelled of coffee and grilled onions. I claimed a booth by the window, nodding to Betty, who had been serving here since David was in elementary school. "Jack Coleman," she greeted me, pouring coffee without asking. "Twice in 2 weeks. We're getting spoiled." "I'm meeting David," I explained. Her smile softened. "How's he doing?" "Heard there might be some trouble in paradise. News traveled fast in our town." "He's figuring things out," I said noncommittally. Betty nodded, understanding the limits of what I was willing to discuss. "Well, his usual breakfast special is still on the menu, even at lunchtime, for our special customers." I thanked her, warmed by the small kindness. This was what Sarah couldn't understand. The value of a community that remembered your favorite meal, that held your history in its collective memory. David arrived a few minutes later, looking more like himself than he had in months. The designer clothes and careful styling that had become his uniform under Sarah's influence were gone, replaced by a simple flannel shirt and jeans. His hair was slightly tousled, his face unshaven. "Dad," he greeted me with a quick hug before sliding into the booth. "You look like you slept better," I observed. He managed a small smile. "Michael's couch isn't exactly five-star accommodations, but yeah, I'm sleeping." Betty appeared, beaming at the sight of him. "David Coleman. Still want your usual?" His face lit up with genuine pleasure. "You remember? 3 eggs over easy, sourdough toast, extra crispy bacon, and hash browns with onions," she recited. "Hard to forget when you ordered it every Sunday for 15 years. After she left, David stared at the tabletop, tracing patterns in the condensation from his water glass. "Sarah called you." It wasn't a question. "Last night," I confirmed. "She told me, said you were manipulative, turning me against her." He looked up, his eyes clear and direct. "She doesn't understand that she's the one who did that herself." I took a sip of coffee, giving him space to continue. "I've been thinking a lot about Mom," he said quietly. "About what she would say if she could see what's happening." "She'd tell you to follow your heart," I replied without hesitation, "but to make sure your head was part of the conversation." David laughed softly. "That sounds exactly like her." His expression grew serious again. "I found something yesterday, when I went to our apartment to get some clothes." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small notebook, its leather cover worn and familiar. My breath caught in my throat. "Mom's journal," I whispered. David nodded. Sarah had taken it from my things, hidden it in her dresser. The implication settled like a stone in my stomach. Margaret had started the journal when David was born, writing entries on his birthdays and major milestones. She had continued even as her illness progressed, determined to leave him a roadmap of her love. After her death, I had given it to David, knowing he would treasure it as I did. "Why would she take it?" I asked, though I suspected the answer. "Control," David said simply. "She wants to erase anything that connects me to my past, to who I really am." Finding the journal was like... He struggled for words, like Mom reaching through time to wake me up. Betty returned with our food, the conversation pausing as she set the plates before us. David's breakfast special looked exactly as it had when he was a teenager. The same careful arrangement of eggs and toast, the same small pitcher of maple syrup on the side. "Just like old times," Betty said with a wink before moving on to her next table. David stared at his plate for a long moment. "Do you remember when I was 16 and I wrecked the car?" he asked suddenly. I nodded, remembering the phone call that had stopped my heart, the sight of the crumpled fender, the relief that he was unharmed. "I was so scared to tell you," he continued. "Not because I thought you'd be angry, but because I didn't want to disappoint you." "You could never disappoint me, son." "I know that now," he said. "But when I called Sarah yesterday, told her I needed more time, the first thing she said was how disappointed she was in me, how I was letting her down, embarrassing her in front of her family. I thought of Sarah's words on the phone. He's weak, sentimental, like you. But I can fix that. You're not responsible for her happiness, David, I said carefully, just as I'm not responsible for yours. We can support each other, love each other, but at the end of the day, we each have to find our own way. He nodded, absorbing the words. I've made an appointment with a counselor, he said after a moment, someone who specializes in manipulative relationships. The admission cost him something. I could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, bracing for judgment, but all I felt was profound relief that he was seeking help. I think that's very brave, I told him honestly. He looked surprised. You do? David, asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom. Recognizing when you need guidance takes courage. Something in his expression shifted, a shadow lifting. That's what Mom would say. She was the wisest person I've ever known. I agreed. We ate in companionable silence for a while, the familiar food a comfort to us both. Outside, the rain had stopped, sunlight beginning to break through the clouds. "Sarah wants to meet," David said finally, pushing his empty plate away. "To talk things through. She says we can work it out, that we just need to communicate better." I kept my expression neutral, though alarm bells were ringing in my mind. "And what do you want?" he sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Part of me wants to believe her, that it could be different, that I could have the life we planned without losing myself in the process. And the other part is terrified that I'll walk into that room and she'll say all the right things, and I'll believe her, that I'll go back, and nothing will really change." The honesty of his answer touched me deeply. "Trust yourself, David. You know the truth when you hear it." He met my eyes across the table. "Would you come with me?" "Not to the meeting itself," he clarified quickly. "Just nearby, for moral support." "Of course," I said without hesitation, "whenever you need me." As we paid the bill and stepped outside into the freshly washed afternoon, I felt a cautious optimism growing within me. David was finding his way back, not just to me, but to himself. "One more thing," he said as we reached our cars. "Nancy called this morning. She's organizing a dinner tonight. Michael will be there, a few other friends. Would you come?" "I'd be honored," I replied, understanding the significance of the invitation. David was reconnecting with the people who knew and loved him for who he truly was. That evening, Nancy's house was filled with laughter and conversation. The dining room table, extended to its full length, accommodated 8 of us. Nancy and her husband Tom, David and me, Michael and his fiancée Emma, and David's former college roommate James with his wife Sophia. It struck me, as I looked around the table, that these were the people who had been noticeably absent from the wedding. The ones Sarah had systematically excluded. The connections she had severed one by one. Nancy had outdone herself with the meal. Margaret's recipes featured prominently, from the roast chicken to the apple pie cooling on the counter. It was a homecoming of sorts, a reminder of the family we had been and could be again. To old friends, Tom raised his glass in a toast. And to new beginnings. We clinked glasses, the simple ritual binding us together in a way formal ceremonies never could. As dinner progressed, I watched David closely, noting how he gradually relaxed, his smile becoming more genuine, his laugh more frequent. This was the son I remembered, thoughtful, kind, with a quick wit that could light up a room. After dessert, as the group moved to the living room for coffee, David pulled me aside. "Thank you for coming," he said quietly. "For everything. Always," I replied simply. "I'm meeting Sarah tomorrow. At the park, neutral ground." I nodded, understanding his strategy. "What time?" 11. "She thinks I'm coming to work things out, to come home." His jaw tightened. "But I'm not. I'm going to tell her I want a separation. Time to really think about what I want, who I want to be." The resolve in his voice was new. Not angry or bitter, but firm. Determined. "I'll be nearby," I promised. "Just say the word if you need me." The next morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of autumn day that showcases New England at its finest. The trees in the park were beginning to turn, touches of gold and crimson appearing among the green. I parked my truck at the far end of the lot, positioned where I could see the bench near the duck pond where David had arranged to meet Sarah. He arrived first, pacing nervously, checking his watch. Sarah appeared precisely at 11, her appearance as calculated as everything else about her. She wore a simple sundress, her hair loose around her shoulders. The picture of the approachable, loving wife, a stark contrast to her usual polished corporate image. From my distance, I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language told the story. Sarah reached for his hands immediately, her face a mask of contrition. David remained standing, keeping space between them. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the resolve in his stance. Sarah's expression shifted from pleading to frustrated. She gestured emphatically, her composure cracking. David shook his head, speaking calmly but firmly. Whatever she was offering, he wasn't accepting it. Then she changed tactics, stepping closer, placing her hand on his chest. An intimate gesture, a reminder of their connection. For a moment, David hesitated, and I held my breath, remembering his fear. I'll walk into that room and she'll say all the right things, and I'll believe her. But he gently removed her hand, taking another step back. Sarah's face transformed, the mask of contrition falling away completely. Even from a distance, I could see the cold fury replacing it. She jabbed a finger toward him, her posture rigid with anger. David simply turned and walked away. I watched as Sarah stood frozen, disbelief evident in every line of her body. Then she stalked to her car, slamming the door with enough force that I could hear it across the park. David made his way toward my truck, his steps becoming lighter with each yard of distance he put between himself and Sarah. By the time he reached me, there was something like peace in his expression. "You did it," I said as he climbed into the passenger seat. "I did," he confirmed, exhaling deeply. "I told her I needed space to figure out who I am without her influence, that I wasn't sure our marriage could or should be saved." "How did she take it?" David laughed humorlessly. "About as well as you'd expect. Accused me of being brainwashed by you and my friends. Said I was throwing away the best thing that ever happened to me." "And what did you say to that?" "That the best thing that ever happened to me was being raised by you and Mom. That you taught me what real love looks like. Supportive, not controlling. Lifting up, not tearing down. Pride and gratitude washed through me. Your mother would be so proud of you right now." "I felt her with me," David said softly. "When I was standing there trying to stay strong, it was like I could hear her voice reminding me of who I really am." We sat in silence for a moment, both feeling Margaret's presence in the space between us. "What happens now?" I finally asked. "Now I figure out how to untangle my life from Sarah's. Legally, financially." He sighed. "It won't be easy, but for the first time in a long time, I feel like I'm heading in the right direction." I started the engine, putting the truck in gear. "Where to?" "Home," David said simply. "If that's okay." "Your room's just as you left it," I assured him, throat tight with emotion. "For as long as you need it." Quote, the next few weeks were a delicate balance. David moved back into his childhood bedroom, commuting to his architectural firm in the city. Sarah refused to leave their apartment, necessitating a careful dance of scheduled times for David to collect more of his belongings. She alternated between tearful pleas for reconciliation and cold fury, often within the same conversation. Through it all, David remained steadfast. His sessions with the counselor were helping him recognize the patterns of manipulation and control that had characterized their relationship from the beginning. With each passing day, he seemed more like himself, the real self that had been buried beneath Sarah's expectations and demands. One evening, about a month after their separation, I found David in the garage, examining the project I had been working on in secret. "Dad, what is this?" he asked, running his hand over the partially finished cabinet. I hadn't meant for him to see it yet. "It's nothing. Just something to keep my hands busy." David circled the workbench, studying the piece from all angles. "This is Mom's design," he said, recognition dawning in his eyes. "From her sketchbook." I nodded, somewhat embarrassed to be caught. She drew it the summer before she got sick. Said it would be perfect for the living room, to hold her books and knickknacks. I never got around to building it for her. "So you're building it now," David said softly. "Seemed like the right time." I shrugged, trying to downplay the emotion behind the project. "With you back home, the house feels more alive." Thought maybe it was time to make some of her other dreams come true too. David was silent for a long moment, his fingers tracing the careful joinery of the half-finished cabinet. "Could I help?" he asked finally. "I'm rusty, but I remember the basics you taught me." The request caught me by surprise. David hadn't shown interest in woodworking since high school, when we had built a bookshelf together for his room. "I'd like that," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'd like that very much." From that evening on, we fell into a new routine. After dinner, we would spend an hour or two in the garage, working side by side on Margaret's cabinet. I taught David the finer points of dovetail joints and showed him how to use the lathe to turn the delicate spindles that would support the glass shelves. The work was therapeutic for both of us. In the quiet concentration of the workshop, with the scent of sawdust in the air and the rhythmic sound of our tools, we found a connection that went beyond words. We were building more than furniture. We were rebuilding our relationship as father and son, as two men finding their way forward after loss. One Saturday morning as we were finishing breakfast, the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Sarah standing on the porch, her expression a carefully composed mask of contrition. "Jack," she greeted me with forced warmth. "I was hoping to speak with David." Before I could respond, David appeared behind me. "Sarah," he said, his voice neutral. "What are you doing here?" "I came to talk," she said, her eyes darting between us. "Privately, if possible." David hesitated, then nodded. "We can talk on the porch." I retreated to the kitchen, giving them space but staying within earshot in case David needed support. Through the window, I could see them sitting on the porch, swing, Margaret's favorite spot, keeping careful distance between them. Their conversation was low, but as it progressed, Sarah's voice rose with increasing frustration. "You're being ridiculous," I heard her say. "Throwing away everything we built because your father can't let go." "This isn't about my father," David replied calmly. "This is about me recognizing that I've lost myself in trying to be what you want." "What I want is for you to grow up," Sarah snapped. "To stop clinging to childhood and become the man you could be." "The man I could be," David repeated thoughtfully. "You know, I've been thinking a lot about that lately. About potential and growth." Sarah leaned forward eagerly, sensing an opening. "Exactly. You have so much potential, David. With my connections, my guidance." "I wasn't finished," he interrupted gently. "I've realized that growth doesn't mean leaving behind the parts of yourself that matter. It means building on the foundation you already have." I felt a surge of pride at his words, recognizing Margaret's wisdom in them. "And what I've built with you," David continued, "isn't growth. It's replacement. You haven't been trying to help me become a better version of myself. You've been trying to erase the original and substitute your own creation." Sarah stood abruptly. "You've changed," she accused. "You're not the man I married." "No," David agreed, rising to face her. "I'm becoming the man I always was. Before I let you convince me he wasn't good enough." Sarah's composure cracked completely. "This is because of him, isn't it?" she demanded, gesturing toward the house. "Toward me. He's poisoned you against me from the beginning." "My father," David said with quiet dignity, "has only ever wanted me to be happy and true to myself. He's never tried to change me or control me. That's the difference between love and possession, Sarah. And I'm finally learning to recognize it." She stared at him for a long moment, calculation visible in her eyes. Then, without another word, she turned and walked to her car, her movements stiff with anger. David watched her drive away, then came back inside. He found me in the kitchen, pretending I hadn't been eavesdropping. "She's gone," he said simply. "For good?" He nodded. "I think so. She threatened to make the divorce difficult, but honestly, I don't care. Material things, money. None of it matters compared to finding myself again." I squeezed his shoulder, words failing me in the face of his courage and clarity. "Come on," he said, a small smile breaking through. "We've got a cabinet to finish." We spent the rest of the day in the garage, working with renewed purpose. By sunset, Margaret's cabinet was complete. Its graceful lines and perfect proportions, exactly as she had sketched them years ago. We carried it into the living room together, positioning it in the corner she had designated in her drawing. "It's perfect," David said, stepping back to admire our work. "Like she's here with us somehow." "She is," I replied, feeling the truth of it in my bones. "Always has been." That night, as I lay in bed listening to the familiar creaks and sighs of the old house, I thought about the journey we had traveled, from the wedding where Sarah had declared, "He doesn't need you anymore," to this moment of healing and reconnection. Margaret had been right, as she so often was. The bond between father and son was sacred, worth fighting for. And in fighting for it, we had both found something we thought was lost. Not just our relationship with each other, but our true selves. Outside, a gentle rain began to fall, its rhythm against the roof a lullaby that had comforted our family through countless nights. I closed my eyes, feeling a peace I hadn't known since Margaret's death. Whatever challenges lay ahead, we would face them together, father and son, strengthened by the love that had guided us home. Spring came early that year, painting our small town with bursts of color and the sweet scent of renewal. It had been 6 months since David moved back home, 6 months of rebuilding and rediscovering. The divorce proceedings, though contentious at times, were finally nearing their end. Sarah had fought every step of the way, using her father's connections to drag out the process, but David had remained steadfast. On this particular Saturday morning, I was in the garden, turning the soil for Margaret's roses. She had always claimed that roses needed conversation as much as they needed water, so I continued her tradition, murmuring encouragement to the tender shoots pushing through the earth. "You'll never guess who I ran into yesterday," David said, appearing at my side with 2 steaming mugs of coffee. He handed one to me and settled onto the garden bench. I straightened, accepting the coffee gratefully. At 62, my back protested more than it used to after a morning of gardening. "Who's that?" "Melissa Taylor," David said, a hint of something new in his voice. "She's back in town, teaching music at the elementary school." Melissa had been David's college girlfriend, a vibrant, kind-hearted young woman who had fit seamlessly into our family before Sarah entered the picture. "Is that right?" I tried to keep my tone neutral, though hope flickered in my chest. "We got coffee," David continued, staring into his mug. "Talked for hours. It was nice. Easy." I nodded, returning to my work to hide my smile. She always was easy to talk to. "She asked about you," David added. "Said she missed our Sunday dinners." The memory was a pleasant one. Melissa at our table, laughing at my terrible jokes, helping Margaret with the dishes, her genuine warmth lighting up the room. "She's always welcome here," I said simply. David was quiet for a moment, watching as I carefully pruned a rosebush. "I invited her to dinner tomorrow," he said finally. "If that's all right with you." I glanced up, meeting his eyes. "This is your home too, son. You don't need my permission to invite friends over." "I know," he acknowledged. "But after everything, I just want to make sure we're doing this right. Building something healthy." The words touched me deeply. In the months since his separation, David had been working hard, not just on finalizing his divorce, but on understanding the patterns that had led him into such a destructive relationship. His weekly sessions with the counselor had given him tools to recognize red flags, to set healthy boundaries, to honor his own needs without being selfish. "Dinner sounds perfect," I assured him. "I'll make Margaret's lasagna." His face lit up. Melissa always loved Mom's lasagna. The next evening, I found myself watching the clock as dinner time approached. I had spent the afternoon cleaning the house and preparing the meal, taking extra care with Margaret's special recipe. David had gone to pick up Melissa, insisting it wasn't a date, just 2 old friends reconnecting. When the front door opened, I heard her laugh before I saw her, bright and genuine, like wind chimes in a summer breeze. Then she was there in our kitchen doorway, her dark hair shorter than I remembered, but her smile just as warm. "Jack," she said, crossing the room to embrace me. "It's been too long." I hugged her back, surprised by how right it felt to have her in our home again. "Welcome back, Melissa." Over dinner, she told us about the years since we'd last seen her graduate school in Boston, teaching music in public schools, her recent decision to return to her hometown after her father's heart attack. Someone needed to keep an eye on him, she explained. And honestly, the city was starting to feel too crowded, too impersonal. "How's he doing now?" I asked, remembering her father as a jovial man who had always treated David like a son. "Better," she smiled. "Stubborn as ever, but following doctor's orders for once. He asked about you, by the way. Said we should get you over for a barbecue when the weather's right." David, who had been unusually quiet, spoke up. "We'd like that." The simple "we" hung in the air, loaded with meaning. Melissa's eyes met his across the table, a silent understanding passing between them. I busied myself with serving second helpings, giving them a moment of privacy within our shared space. After dinner, David insisted on clearing the table while Melissa and I moved to the living room. She paused at Margaret's cabinet, admiring its craftsmanship. "David told me you built this together," she said, running her fingers along the smooth oak surface. "It's beautiful." "It was Margaret's design," I explained. One of her dreams we finally brought to life. Melissa nodded, understanding the significance. She always had an eye for beauty. She turned to face me, her expression serious. Jack, I want you to know, I'm not trying to rush anything with David. He's been through so much, and he's still healing. I appreciate that, I said, but I also know my son. He's stronger than he looks, and he knows his own mind. She smiled, relief evident in her expression. I've missed him. Missed all of this, really. Your family, this house. It always felt like a second home to me. It still can, I said simply. From the kitchen came the sound of dishes being stacked in the dishwasher. The familiar domestic noise, a counterpoint to our conversation. Melissa glanced toward the sound, her face softening. He's different now, more himself somehow. He lost his way for a while, I acknowledged, but he found his way back. When David rejoined us, the three of us fell into easy conversation, sharing stories and catching up on the years we had missed in each other's lives. It wasn't until the grandfather clock in the hall struck 10 that Melissa reluctantly announced she needed to head home. Dad's waiting up, she explained. Doctor's orders or not, he still thinks I'm 16 sometimes. David offered to drive her, and I watched from the porch as they walked to his car, their shoulders nearly touching, heads bent in private conversation. There was something tentative yet familiar in their interaction, like dancers remembering steps to a song they hadn't heard in years. After David returned, we sat on the porch swing in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds. Crickets tuning up for their evening concert, the distant hoot of an owl, the soft creak of the swing's chains. It wasn't planned, David said finally, running into her, but when I saw her there in the coffee shop it was like, he searched for words. Like coming up for air after being underwater too long. I nodded, understanding perfectly. Sometimes life gives us second chances when we least expect them. Do you think it's too soon? He asked, the question revealing the lingering uncertainty from his failed marriage. After Sarah, I mean. I considered the question carefully. Time isn't always the best measure for these things. It's about whether you're ready, whether you've done the work to understand what went wrong and how to do better next time. David was quiet, absorbing my words. I think I have, he said finally. Or at least, I'm trying to. That's all any of us can do, I assured him. Try, learn, grow. The next few weeks brought a gentle shift in our household routine. David and Melissa began spending more time together, hiking in the state park, attending community concerts, cooking dinner in our kitchen. They moved slowly, deliberately, both aware of the weight of their shared history and the potential of their reconnection. One evening in late April, I returned home from a woodworking club meeting to find them sitting at the kitchen table, poring over a stack of papers spread before them. Dad? David looked up, his expression a mix of excitement and apprehension. We need your opinion on something. I set down my keys, intrigued. What's up? Melissa pushed a set of blueprints toward me. My father's thinking of selling the old Petersham property. You know, the farmhouse and barn on the edge of town? I nodded, familiar with the property. John Taylor had inherited it from his uncle years ago, but had never developed it, allowing the 100-year-old farmhouse and barn to sit vacant, though still structurally sound. David and I were thinking, she continued, a hint of nervousness in her voice. What if we renovated it? The barn could be converted into a community music space, for lessons, small concerts, and the farmhouse. She glanced at David. Could be a home. He finished. Eventually, when we're ready for that step. The implications weren't lost on me. This wasn't just a renovation project. It was a vision for a future together. I studied the blueprints, noting David's architectural expertise in the careful plans for modernizing while preserving the historic character of the buildings. It's ambitious, I said finally, but beautiful. You'd be bringing something valuable back to the community. Relief washed over both their faces. We'd need help, David admitted, especially with the woodworking details. If you were interested, The invitation warmed me more than he could know. Not just the recognition of my skills, but the inclusion in their plans, their future. I'd be honored, I told them honestly. That night, long after David and Melissa had left to present their initial plans to her father, I sat in Margaret's reading chair, her photograph in my hands. "They're finding their way, Maggie," I told her quietly. "Both of them. Together." I could almost hear her reply, gentle and wise. "That's all we ever wanted for him, Jack. The chance to build a life filled with love." The Petersham property project began in earnest. As spring deepened into summer, weekends found the four of us, David, Melissa, John Taylor, and myself, clearing decades of neglect from the old buildings. We worked from dawn until dusk, stripping wallpaper, reinforcing beams, replacing rotted floorboards. It was exhausting, satisfying work. Other friends joined the effort as word spread. Michael and Emma devoted Saturdays to helping restore the barn's roof. Nancy and Tom contributed gardening expertise, clearing the overgrown land and planning new landscaping. Even David's colleagues from the architectural firm volunteered their professional services, ensuring the renovations met modern codes while preserving historical elements. "It's becoming a barn raising," Melissa laughed one evening as we all collapsed on the farmhouse's newly finished porch, surveying our progress. "Like something out of an old movie." "Community," John Taylor said, his voice gruff with emotion. "This is what it's supposed to be. Neighbors helping neighbors build something that matters." I caught David's eye across the porch, sharing a silent moment of understanding. This project had become more than a renovation. It was healing for all of us. Each nail driven, each wall rebuilt, was an act of faith in the future. As summer reached its peak, so did our efforts. The barn's transformation was particularly remarkable. From a sagging structure on the verge of collapse to a soaring space with perfect acoustics. Melissa had already started a waiting list of students eager for lessons in the new music center. The farmhouse, while still a work in progress, was beginning to feel like a home. David and Melissa had chosen warm colors for the walls, installed large windows to capture the natural light, and preserved the original hardwood floors that told the story of generations who had lived there before. I was in the kitchen one afternoon, installing the custom cabinetry I had built in my workshop, when David found me. "Dad," he said, his voice unusually serious. "Got a minute?" I set down my tools, giving him my full attention. "What's on your mind?" He leaned against the doorframe, suddenly looking very young, very vulnerable. "I'm going to ask Melissa to marry me." Though I had suspected this was coming, hearing the words aloud still filled me with emotion. "Son, that's wonderful news. It's not too soon?" The question revealed his lingering insecurity, the scars from his first marriage still tender. "When it's right, I told him. "And this, what you and Melissa have built together, it's right." He exhaled, shoulders relaxing. "I thought so too, but I needed to hear it from you." "Your mother would approve," I added softly. "She always had a soft spot for Melissa." David nodded, swallowing hard. "I know. That's part of why it feels so right. Like we've come full circle somehow. Have you thought about how you'll ask her?" A smile broke across his face. "Actually, I have a plan. And I need your help." The plan, as it turned out, was elegantly simple. David wanted to host a small gathering at the nearly completed farmhouse, ostensibly to thank everyone who had contributed to the renovation. At sunset, he would ask Melissa to join him in the garden, where a string quartet, former students of hers, would be waiting to play their song. My role was to create a small wooden box for the ring, crafted from the same oak we had used for Margaret's cabinet. I worked on it in secret, carving delicate musical notes around the edges, lining the interior with velvet, the color of the roses in our garden. The evening of the gathering arrived, warm and clear, the kind of perfect summer night that seems designed for milestone moments. Friends and neighbors gathered on the farmhouse lawn, admiring the transformation of the property. Lanterns hung from tree branches, casting a golden glow over the scene. I found myself standing with John Taylor, watching as David led Melissa toward the garden, where the hidden musicians waited. "Never thought I'd get a second chance to see her this happy," John said quietly. After that fiasco with her ex-fiancé in Boston, I was afraid she'd given up on love altogether. I nodded, understanding completely. Life has a way of coming full circle when we least expect it. Speaking of which, John turned to face me directly. "I hear Sarah's family is moving. Her father's practice is relocating to Chicago." The news surprised me. I hadn't heard. John shrugged. "Small town. Word gets around." Apparently, the scandal was too much for them. David leaving Sarah, the rumors about her behavior. Status means everything to people like that. Before I could respond, the first notes of music floated through the evening air. Conversation around us quieted as everyone turned toward the garden. Though we couldn't see the moment itself, the sudden burst of applause and Melissa's joyful cry told us everything we needed to know. They emerged from the garden moments later, Melissa's face radiant with happiness, the ring, nestled in my handcrafted box, now sparkling on her finger. Friends surged forward to congratulate them, the celebration spontaneous and heartfelt. I stayed back, watching the scene with a full heart. David caught my eye across the crowd and mouthed a simple, "Thank you," before being pulled back into the festivities. Later, as the gathering began to disperse, I found myself alone on the porch, gazing up at the stars that seemed particularly bright that night. "Room for one more?" Nancy's voice interrupted my thoughts as she settled into the chair beside me. "Always," I assured her. "Quite a night," she observed, her eyes on the remaining guests saying their goodbyes. Margaret would have loved every minute of it. "She's here," I said with certainty, watching over all of it. Nancy reached over and squeezed my hand. "You did good, Jack. When Sarah said he didn't need you anymore, well, you proved just how wrong she was." I shook my head. It wasn't about proving anything. It was about being there when he did need me, even when he couldn't see it himself. "That's what real love is," Nancy said softly. "Showing up, staying steady, holding space for someone to find their way back to themselves." As if summoned by our conversation, David and Melissa appeared at the bottom of the porch steps, hand in hand, their faces glowing with happiness. "Dad," David called, "we're heading down to the barn. Melissa wants to play something on the new piano. Care to join us?" I rose, feeling the weight of the past few years lifting with each step. Wouldn't miss it for the world. The four of us, David, Melissa, Nancy, and I, walked across the moonlit lawn toward the barn. Inside, the space had been transformed into a small concert hall, with the baby grand piano, a gift from Melissa's former professor, taking center stage. Melissa sat at the keyboard, fingers hovering for a moment before beginning to play. The notes of "What a Wonderful World," Margaret's favorite song, the one that had been co-opted for the mother-son dance at David's first wedding, filled the space. But this time, the music wasn't a reminder of loss or exclusion. It was a tribute, a celebration, a bridge between past and future. David moved to stand beside me, his arm around my shoulders. "I found Mom's letter," he said quietly, "the one she wrote about fighting for what matters." I nodded, remembering Margaret's words that had given me the courage to stand firm when Sarah tried to push me out of David's life. "She was right," David continued. "About everything. About the kind of love that lifts up instead of tears down. About the importance of remembering who you really are." As Melissa played the final notes, the music lingering in the perfect acoustics of the barn, I felt a sense of completion. Not an ending, but a resolution, the kind that acknowledges pain while celebrating healing, that honors the past while embracing the future. Outside, the summer night wrapped around the old buildings like a blessing, stars scattered across the sky like diamonds on velvet. And somewhere, I was certain, Margaret was smiling. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn day that painted the landscape in gold and crimson, David and Melissa were married in the garden of the fully restored farmhouse. The ceremony was simple, intimate, a gathering of those who had supported their journey individually and together. I stood beside David as his best man, watching as Melissa walked toward him on her father's arm. Her dress was elegant but understated, her smile radiant with certainty. When she reached David, John placed her hand in my son's, then turned and embraced me briefly before taking his seat. The gesture, so different from the cold formality of David's first wedding, brought tears to my eyes. This was what family should be. Not a competition for influence or control, but a circle of love expanding to include more hearts, more lives. As they exchanged vows, I felt Margaret's presence beside me, witnessing the moment. "He doesn't need you anymore," Sarah had said at their wedding. But what she hadn't understood, what this day proved beyond any doubt, was that love isn't about need or possession, it's about choice. About showing up, day after day, in the lives of those we cherish. About creating space for them to grow, while remaining a steady presence they can always return to. At the reception, held in the barn-turned-music hall, I watched as David and Melissa shared their first dance as husband and wife. The string quartet played softly, the afternoon light streaming through the windows to create a golden halo around the couple. David caught my eye across the room and smiled. Not the uncertain, seeking smile of a boy looking for approval, but the confident, peaceful smile of a man who knew exactly who he was and where he belonged. In that moment, I understood that our journey had come full circle. From the painful words spoken at his first wedding to this day of authentic celebration, we had traveled a path of loss, rediscovery, and renewal. The road hadn't been easy, but it had led us home, to ourselves, to each other, to the kind of love that builds rather than diminishes. Later, as evening fell and the celebration continued around us, I stepped outside for a moment of quiet reflection. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, each one a pinpoint of light against the vastness. I touched the chain around my neck, feeling the comforting weight of Margaret's ring next to mine. "We did it, Maggie," I whispered to the night. "We kept our promise. We protected what matters." A gentle breeze stirred the leaves, carrying the scent of autumn and the distant sound of laughter from inside the barn. In that perfect moment, I felt a profound sense of peace. The kind that comes from knowing that whatever challenges life might bring, love remains stronger than any force that tries to diminish it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.